wherever you are, I would say the first thing to start with is find out what's there. Look around and see what you have, because you might have plants that are great that you don't even know about, that because you didn't plant them intentionally, so you may not notice them. And I know there's a movement in some places called No Mow May, where people don't mow their lawns in May. I'm not necessarily all in favor of that. It kind of depends, because sometimes you're just letting your grass grow and that grass is non-native and it's just seeding and you're just making more grass. But it could be that you find that you have other things growing there that are really interesting. So when I didn't mow for a couple of weeks, I found these flowers growing and I didn't know what they were. And it turned out they were native, and I didn't plant them. They were just, birds probably brought the seeds, or, somehow they got there, the wind. And so you might find out that you have something interesting. And if you find out that you have a bad weed, and you can just pull that weed, and maybe you don't plant anything there, you just see what comes back. Or maybe you do go and plant one native plant in one spot in your yard and just see what comes to it, see how it does. And there's nothing more rewarding to me than seeing this thing grow that you did, and then seeing bees or birds or butterflies come to it and seeing it fulfill its function as part of the ecosystem. It's very rewarding.
I'm Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental journalist, and this is the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. Thank you for joining us so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. What does it mean to restore the land? And where do you even begin when faced with the complexity of ecological repair? In episode 181 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, I am joined by Paula Whyman, author of Bad Naturalist, to explore what happens when one person takes on the challenge of rewilding a landscape and the lessons learned along the way. She also has an award-winning short story collection, You May See a Stranger, and her work has appeared in the Washington Post, American Scholar, and more. And in her new book, And This Conversation, Paula shares real-world realities of restoring damaged ecosystems, complete with unexpected surprises, setbacks, and personal growth. But this isn't just a story about managing hundreds of acres. It's about recognizing that anyone, no matter where they live, can reconnect with nature and make a difference. Whether it's in a backyard garden, a city balcony, a patch of lawn, restoration and rewilding can begin wherever you are. And I think this conversation lands at just the right time. In a world where we're constantly bombarded by bad news, it's easy to feel powerless. When my anxiety spikes, my therapist likes to remind me to focus on what I can control. And Paula's story is a reminder of that, of the simple, tangible ways that we can tend to our lives and communities. It's a hopeful, inspiring conversation to carry you through into spring and summer as we look for ways to reconnect with the natural world and hopefully spark a little joy close to home. Thank you for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast today. I am excited to talk about all of your work and especially your newest book, Bad Naturalist. But before we get to that, I'll start with my standard get to know you question, which is, how did you first fall in love with outdoor spaces, and how does getting outside fit into your life now?
That's a great question. When I was a kid, I wanted nothing more than to sit on the ground and look for insects. And so bugs were my sort of gateway into the outdoors. And I was in the suburbs, and the backyard was like my park. And I would sit and I would collect cicadas and let them crawl on me. I would collect caterpillars in bug houses and wait for them to make cocoons and be disappointed when they didn't. I would, use magnifying glass and watch ants and things like that. And from there, I really was interested in working with animals. So at some point I decided I was going to be a veterinarian, and then that turned out to be a bad idea for me. But I was always interested. I continued being interested in insects and wildlife. And sort of continued a lot of hobbyist reading as I was growing up, and would sort of get out with my kids. We would go on invasive plant hunts with, local park and all kinds of things. So it kept going. Oh,
Yeah.
and now how does it fit in my life? Well, right now I'm spending a lot of time on top of a mountain, surrounded by wild nature, and getting out here and trying to manage things to improve the meadows.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about how you came to that place because you didn't always live on the property you're at now. So, what inspired you to head to the mountains and then pursue ecologic restoration?
Well, that's a great question, and I think there was kind of a chicken and egg thing, but because I was already sort of a hobbyist, uh, avid, interested in the natural world, I was already doing a lot of reading, and I had been reading about rewilding, specifically Isabella Tree's book Wilding, about restoring her 3,000 plus acre farm in England to nature, basically letting it go back to nature and bringing in animals that mimicked the animals that once lived there. And at the same time, I was reading Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Best Hope, where he talked about bringing native plants back to suburban yards and replacing some of your non-native lawn grasses with native plants to feed pollinators and birds and so on. So I had all of this in my mind. And for many years, my husband and I we had the idea or the plan of moving to the country once it was feasible. And it took a long time. I think we talked about it for 30 years. And then when our kids became young adults and launched, then we thought, okay, maybe we can do this now. And we had started looking again in earnest about, almost 6 years ago now, I guess. And at that time, I was doing that reading about rewilding and about native plants. And I thought, I would like to, wherever we end up, I would like to plant a small native meadow. And we were just looking for a small piece of land, probably an old field or an old pasture where I could raise a few sheep and have a vegetable garden and plant this meadow. And my husband, who is an Eagle Scout, was really interested in just communing with nature, making trails in the woods, things like that, just to have him just being able to be outdoors all the time. And then we came to this place that neither of us expected to find. We came here really just to see the view because we had heard it was a really lovely, unusual view. And when we came here, it was August. It was very hot and bright, and the mountaintop had not been mowed in at least a couple of years, but they had mowed this little path through all of these overgrown plants so that you could get to the top or get to a high point. There are a couple of high points. To get there, we had to first hike up the road because the road, which is a gravel road, was not finished back then. It was finished at the bottom, but it didn't go all the way up. So we hiked to the top, and then we came to this meadow where everything was over our heads. Like all of the plant growth was like 6 feet tall and more. And we get up to this high point, and there are bees all over the place, and there are these yellow flowers that are over my head on all sides. And when I look out, I see rolling hills, acres and acres. I have no idea how many acres at that point of these yellow flowers and other, crazy plants, just like this, I don't know. It was just dense, overwhelming growth and bees and birds and everything in the sun. And I stood there and I thought, okay, I knew it used to be a cattle pasture for a long time and that it wasn't really being used anymore. And I thought, well, I had this idea to plant this little small meadow and have this little piece of land and this little garden. And now I'm looking out at this acres and acres of what turned out to be a 75-acre open meadow on top of a mountain, which is very unusual, surrounded by forested hills, forested slopes. And my small plans started to look really too small. And this these fields sort of presented themselves as a chance to really do something ambitious and make a big impact. And I thought, wow, what if I could do something with these fields? I wonder, I don't know anything about them except that it was a cattle pasture. I don't know what kind of plants are here. I don't know anything about plants. I disregarded all of this. And I just said, I'm going to do this. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to do. I want to do like what Isabella Tree did on her farm and what Doug Tallamy is recommending people do. I want to do that here. And the first thing I had to do was find out really how to do that. I knew nothing about plants. I was a bad gardener. I was an unsuccessful gardener so far. So what made me think that I could do this? But I was very interested in it from the, wildlife standpoint, birds and animals and insects and so on, pollinators. And that's when I started, I basically started doing research and asking questions.
That's awesome. I mean, I feel like that happens to people sometimes. Like visit a property and they kind of just fall in love and they see that vision that they have for their future, but it doesn't always work out the way that you think it will, which I think you represent really well in your book.
Thank you.
Is that there's not necessarily that perfect solution when you're trying to restore a landscape. And how I know that I'm of course going to recommend that people read your book, but if you could give kind of like a synopsis or like a timeline of like, how did you actually tackle this project? And how did you come to terms with the fact that it was not going to go according to your plan?
I'm still coming to terms with that. I have been working on this project at this point now just under 4 years. And just to put it in perspective, I didn't have a house here for most of that time. So I was coming and going, making day trips from the city. And my husband would occasionally camp out here. But as far as where I started, the first thing I had to do was figure out what questions to ask and figure out whom to ask. So I started talking to people and sort of collecting names of experts. And one of the first people I spoke with was a woman named Charlotte Lorick at the Virginia Working Landscapes, which is part of the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. And Virginia Working Landscapes does surveys on farms, and this is a farm. They come out and try to see what kinds of plants and birds you have. So the first thing I needed to do was figure out what I was starting with, so I could figure out where to go from there. And the only way I could do that was to ask people who knew more than I did about plants and birds and ecological restoration. So that was my first step. There was a survey here, and it sort of gave me an indication of what the dominant plants were, both good and bad, and what kind of birds we had and what we might want to try to work toward. And then, let's see, one of the next things I did after that was get in touch with, there's a department in USDA called NRCS, National Resources Conservation Service. I hope I have that right. And what they will do is come out and look at what you have, talk to you about your goals, and help make a plan, because they have years of experience doing ecological restoration and trying to bring back native meadows. And so I had many meetings with folks at NRCS who are conservation biologists, soil specialists. And what I eventually learned was that I had a good concentration of native plants here, but I also had a high concentration of invasive plants that would effectively push those native plants out and prevent them from growing and prevent ground nesting birds from coming back. And ground nesting birds are in decline. So that was one of my big goals. So I also had to set goals. And so to figure out what to do first, it was first see what I have. And that I did by talking to people and also just getting out there and every day walking around and looking at things. And I would send Charlotte, who was a plant specialist, I would send her pictures and say, what is this? And she could recognize things in winter, which I still think is incredible. When they look dead, she knew what they were. And then I just lost track of the rest of your question.
Oh, no, that's great. Yeah, no, I was just wondering kind of like how you got to the point that you are now and like how you're working on the project.
Okay.
So I think that that's like a good introduction of like, what were the first steps and how did you actually decide what you were prioritizing? You mentioned that you had the goals for the nesting birds and then learning about the native plants. But were there other ways that you decided on which things to tackle first and kind of like the progress and how to make that progress?
Yes, once I understood that I had all of these invasive plants, and once I understood what invasive plants were and what they would do and how they would threaten the local ecosystem, I decided that my first job was going to be to try to manage these plants. But the word manage wasn't the first word that I used for that. I was going to get rid of them. That's what I thought I was going to do. But that's on a property this size, at least that's not realistic. And it's often not realistic, but managing is doable. And because trees, for instance, can be directly targeted with an herbicide, you're not harming anything else if you target invasive trees individually. So that was the first thing I started with. I wanted to get those under control because we had, for example, a big grove of ailanthus or tree of heaven. And some people might know the tree of heaven because it's the favorite place for spotted lanternflies, which are a big problem right now in the East. That's an invasive insect that kills grapevines or destroys grapes and lots of other trees. And the ailanthus is the host. But even if the ailanthus was not the host, it would be a problem. So that was one of the trees I targeted. There were 3 basically that I targeted. And then my next plan was whenever I noticed an invasive plant in a new place, I would try to pull it, mow it, repeatedly, try to get that under control so it didn't spread. I was trying to keep the invasive plants from expanding into new parts of the meadow. The problem was that while I was paying attention to one part of the meadow, something was happening over on the other side of the meadow that I wouldn't find out about until. So it was really hard to juggle doing all these things at once, and I didn't have a lot. There wasn't a lot of like labor assistance. It was me and some, occasionally nonprofit organizations and occasionally like people who were available to hire to help me with bush hogging or spraying things because I wasn't, I did attempt at one point tree treatments on my own, and it turned out wasn't a great idea. When I went out and bought a hatchet and said I was going to cut wedges around the trunk of a tree and insert the pesticide, because that's how you do it. It's a method called hack and squirt. That's how you do it with certain trees. My husband was very concerned that I've never used a hatchet and I am notoriously accident prone. So, yeah.
I mean, you already overviewed a fair share of challenges that you may have run into, but are there other ones that kind of stick out in your mind that were like a surprise in this restoration journey?
Yeah, well, sometimes I had good surprises, but one of the big challenges for me was waiting. I am not a patient person, and every part of this project involves waiting. Either I'm waiting for plants to grow, to see what grows back after I've cut something, pulled something, burned something, a lot of waiting. And sometimes it can be months of waiting, and in some cases, years of waiting. So that's a challenge. And then once you've waited, if the outcome isn't what you were hoping for, it can be a big bummer. Or sometimes the outcome is what I was hoping for, but then I'll turn my attention to something else. Like this happened in a few acres of field that was overrun by one kind of invasive plant. We cut all those plants out, basically removed them by their roots, and then I was really happy to see several weeks later native plants growing back, because that's one of the great things about here, at least in Virginia, and I think it's true in a lot of this country, that in the seed bank you have native plants that are dormant, and the seeds are dormant, and if you make room for them, if they can get light and nourishment and so on, they will grow. So that's the lucky part here. The problem is that also waiting in that seed bank, especially, are the seeds of annual weeds that can stay there for years and years and just waiting for an opportunity. And often that opportunity is disturbance. So when we disturb ground to build or clear a field, like I just was talking about, that can make room for the wrong kind of plant to grow. So I was really happy. I'd seen all these native plants, and then I went to the other side of the mountain to pull these patches of 3-foot tall stilk grass that I'd found in a new place. I really wanted to get rid of that, and I wasn't at all worried about that other spot because I had milkweed growing, I had crownbeard growing, I had tick trefoil, I had all these great plants. And then one day I went back there just to see them. And it's, when I say I went back there, it's more than half a mile from where I was. So it was kind of out of the way. And I was shocked to see that there had been something waiting for me to turn my head, apparently. And that's when an invasive vine basically had taken over the fields. And this was like acres of invasive vine, and I just hadn't been able to see it among all of the dense plants that were growing until it was too late. So that was the point where, okay, that was a big disappointment, a big frustration, where I thought, why am I doing this? I'm really bad at this. I'm just bad at this. But I do get good surprises when I burned one hillside and native plants grew back, and it didn't get invaded by by a bad vine. That I was really happy about that.
Yeah, it is nice that there's a mix of like good surprises as well to kind of like keep you inspired and be like, oh, this is wonderful. There's so many new things to learn. And I know listeners, some of them may live on a property similar to your size, but a lot of them likely don't have so much land, and they may want to make an impact and restore their property in some manner. So if I think of where I live right now, I have a front yard and a backyard. And so obviously there is some property where I could plant plants or involve more like landscaping things to invite animals or insects, whatever it might be. So how do you think people can apply the lessons that you learned in your journey, their ongoing journey, to implement it on their own properties or in their own lives?
That's a great question. I would say I have lived in apartments. I've lived in a suburb with, the small backyard, and now I'm on this mountain. And every place, it really doesn't matter where you are, there's always some part of the natural world to be found near you. So if you're in an apartment and you can do a window box and you can plant something native in that window box, and you'll see pollinators come, you might see butterflies, you might see birds. And if you don't cut them when they're seeding, the birds will come and eat the seeds. So, and the other thing you can do is, if you have a local park, you can find out if there is a group that's helping to maintain the local park, and you can have some impact there. That's something that, at least in the Washington, D.C. area where I grew up, there were a lot of opportunities for that. And I know it's not the case everywhere, but sometimes you can also make your own opportunities for things like that. And if you do have a backyard, wherever you are, I would say the first thing to start with is find out what's there. Look around and see what you have, because you might have plants that are great that you don't even know about, that because you didn't plant them intentionally, so you may not notice them. And I know there's a movement in some places called No Mow May, where people don't mow their lawns in May. I'm not necessarily all in favor of that. It kind of depends, because sometimes you're just letting your grass grow and that grass is non-native and it's just seeding and you're just making more grass. But it could be that you find that you have other things growing there that are really interesting. So when I didn't mow for a couple of weeks, I found these flowers growing and I didn't know what they were. And it turned out they were native, and I didn't plant them. They were just, birds probably brought the seeds, or, somehow they got there, the wind. And so you might find out that you have something interesting. And if you find out that you have a bad weed, and you can just pull that weed, and maybe you don't plant anything there, you just see what comes back. Or maybe you do go and plant one native plant in one spot in your yard and just see what comes to it, see how it does. And there's nothing more rewarding to me than seeing this thing grow that you did, and then seeing bees or birds or butterflies come to it and seeing it fulfill its function as part of the ecosystem. It's very rewarding. And I would say that close attention to your surroundings leads to inspiration to do things like that. The more you pay attention, the more questions you're likely to ask, the more you're likely to learn. And the more, at least for me, the more I'm likely to want to do something. It's sort of empowering to do one small thing and see something happen as a result. So I would say also, the other thing I would say is go for the thing that grabs you. Don't try to force yourself to do something like take your medicine, because, it shouldn't be like taking medicine. It should be, try to make it fun. Make it the thing. Like, I was always into insects, so I'm always going around here looking at insects on plants and seeing like what's new. Whatever you're into, let that be the thing that guides you, because then you'll be more likely to do something and to stick with it and to actually enjoy it. And it doesn't have to be dire. I think there should be hope out there. I'm hoping that my book is hopeful and has a hopeful message, and leads people to feel upbeat about what they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it can be really inspiring to get to see someone's entire journey, because I think a lot of times we maybe just fixate or see the end result and we're like, wow, that's so amazing. I wonder how they did that. But you get to see like the full picture with your story, which I think can be really inspiring. And you mentioned paying more attention to the nature around us. So what are some ways that people can start paying attention to the nature that is around them in a more meaningful way?
Well, one of the things that I realized I didn't do as much when I was in the suburbs, I focused on the pests, the things that were trying to get into my house that I didn't want to be there. I didn't focus on the things that weren't trying to get into my house that just belonged. Of course, I noticed the birds. I noticed when there were cardinals or blue jays, or a pair of mallards weirdly landed in my yard one day. But I didn't pay close attention to the plants, because at that time I wasn't focused on the plants. And so I think, I just lost track of the question again.
Oh, just how can you start paying more attention to nature in more meaningful ways?
Okay. Well, I think the first thing to do is just get out and take a walk. Just take a walk wherever you are. And see if you're in the city, there are birds. See what birds you notice around. Listen for the bird sounds if you can hear them over the traffic. And, look at what's growing opportunistically, because there are all kinds of plants that just grow wherever they happen to land. And some of them might be good plants. They might not all be like bad weeds or anything. And just more noticing wherever you are.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to take a moment to slow down and observe. And then I think you can learn a lot of new things about the place that you live. But what are some things that you hope that if someone reads your book, that they would take away from it, both in regards to conservation, but also hopefully about themselves?
Well, I think this project was a more ambitious project than I've ever tried to do. And if you had told me several years ago that I was going to end up doing this, I would have been, what, really? I read about conservation biology, I read about this and I read about that, and I look at bugs, but I wouldn't have guessed that. And so I would just say, be okay with stepping out of your comfort zone, and be okay to try something bigger than you've tried before. And it's okay to be ambitious, and it's okay if you don't know the answers. Just ask a lot of questions. Be okay with not knowing. Ask a lot of questions and start small. Start small, but think big.
I love that. Yeah, I feel like a lot of times when you're starting a project like that, like you mentioned in the beginning, is just ask people that know more than you and ask for their help. And usually they are so passionate about these types of projects that they're very willing to offer the resources that you actually need. But is there anything else that you feel like we missed that you wanted to add?
I would just confirm what you're saying, that there were so many organizations when I actually started looking, and some of them are specifically geared toward farms. But if you don't have a farm, there are often local, state, and federal organizations that are there that can offer help. Like the local jurisdiction where I was living for many years in the suburbs had a program to help people who wanted to install rain gardens. They would help pay for it. So, and I didn't even know about that until I started thinking about those things. So see what your local jurisdiction offers. See what nonprofit groups exist for conservation in your area, and reach out to them. Like you said, everyone I talked to was so willing to answer questions and was really happy that, that people were asking. And I'm really lucky here to have so many great organizations. If I tried to list all of them that were helpful, it would take a while, but there were so many, and they sincerely want to help.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, how can listeners learn more about your work and hopefully check out a copy of Bad Naturalist?
Well, I suggest going to my website, which is paulawhyman.com. And there you can find a list of my schedule of events. And if you're in a town or city where I'm going to be, I would love to meet you. And you can also link to my Bad Naturalist newsletter, where I talk about what I'm doing on the mountain now and what I'm finding there, with lots of photos. And also, you can contact me through my contact page, because I love talking with readers if you have questions, or if your book club wants to talk with me or anything. And the book is available anywhere you buy books, independent bookstores, and so on.
I'll be sure to link to all of those resources and some of the resources you mentioned earlier in the show notes, so people can easily access all of that there. But with that, Paula, thank you so much for taking the time to share.
Thank you so much for having me on. This is a really fun conversation.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.